Sema had always been meticulous about her appearance, especially her long, thick black hair that reached down to her waist. As an English teacher at a local college, she spent her days preparing lessons, grading papers, and teaching students with great enthusiasm. But there was a secret she kept hidden from everyone, a deep desire that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Sema, now 38 years old, had a hair fetish. She was fascinated by the idea of having her head shaved completely bald. But there was one obstacle that stood in her way. Her husband. He was conservative, and she knew that if she even suggested such a drastic change, it would lead to arguments and disappointment. Sema's days were often spent in her classroom, engaging her students in literature and encouraging them to express themselves through writing. But when she wasn't at work, her thoughts would often drift toward her unfulfilled desire to write. She would sit in front of the mirror in her bedroom, imagining what she would look like with her head shaved, running her fingers through her long hair, and wishing she could make the decision for herself. Her life was otherwise routine. She had a few close friends she would meet for coffee or lunch, but she rarely spoke about her personal struggles. She spent most of her time at home with her husband, who was supportive in many ways but would never understand her secret longing. In the evenings, Sema would prepare dinner and settle down with a book, but the thought of shaving her head never left her mind. It wasn't until one day, when one of her students, Vikram, a quiet and respectful young man of 19 years old, came to her house for some extra help with his assignments, that Sema saw an unexpected opportunity. Vikram had always admired his teacher for her intelligence and kindness. He respected her deeply and often looked up to her as a mentor. That evening, he arrived with a pile of notes, expecting a regular session of studying. But as they sat down in her cozy living room, something was different about Sema. She seemed distant, lost in thought. After a while, she set down the books and looked directly at him. Her voice was calm but firm. "Vikram, can I ask you something personal?" He blinked, surprised by her sudden change in tone. "Of course, ma'am. You can ask me anything." Sema hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then she spoke. "Do you like me?" Vikram, confused by the question, nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I respect you a lot. You're a great teacher." She gave him a small smile, but there was a seriousness in her eyes. "I appreciate that. But what if I asked you to do something for me? Something unusual. Would you still respect me?" He frowned slightly, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" Sema leaned forward, her voice lowering. "I want you to shave my head." Vikram's eyes widened, his heart skipping a beat. "What?" "No, ma'am, I can't do that." But Sema wasn't backing down. "Please, Vikram, I need you to help me. It's something I've wanted for a long time, but my husband would never allow it. If you do this for me, I can tell him that one of my students did it. That way, I can have what I want without causing trouble in my marriage." Vikram was at a loss for words. He had never imagined his teacher would ask him for something so strange, so intimate. I don't think I can, ma'am. It feels wrong." Sema's eyes softened, and for a moment Vikram saw the vulnerability behind her strong exterior. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I trust you, Vikram. You're mature enough to understand why this is important to me. Please, just this once." The room was thick with silence as Vikram wrestled with his thoughts. His respect for Sema made it hard to refuse, but the request felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Yet her pleading eyes stirred something in him, a sense of duty, maybe even loyalty. After what felt like an eternity, Vikram finally nodded, albeit hesitantly. "All right, ma'am." But are you sure about this? Sema's face lit up with relief. Yes, Vikram, I'm sure. Thank you. She stood up and walked over to a drawer, pulling out a pair of clippers that she had hidden away. She handed them to Vikram, her hands trembling slightly. Please just do it. Start slow and take it all off. Vikram stood up, his palms sweating as he took the clippers. He glanced at Sema, who had already taken a seat in front of the mirror, her long hair flowing over her shoulders. Slowly, he draped a towel around her neck and switched on the clippers, the buzzing sound filling the room. Here we go, he whispered, more to himself than to her. As he brought the clippers to her head. The first pass was the hardest. Sema closed her eyes as Vikram hesitantly moved the clippers through her thick hair, watching in silence as strands of black hair fell to the floor. He took his time, unsure of his actions, but as the minutes passed, he became more confident. Soon Sema's scalp started to emerge, and she let out a soft sigh of satisfaction. The transformation was slow but steady. Vikram carefully shaved every inch of her head, making sure to leave no hair behind. By the time he was finished, Sema was completely bald, her scalp smooth and shining under the light. She opened her eyes and looked at herself in the mirror. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Thank you, Vikram, she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. You don't know how much this means to me. Vikram, still in shock from what he had just done, nodded. Are you going to be okay, Ma? I am. What will your husband say? Sema smiled faintly, running her hand over her smooth scalp. I'll tell him the truth, that my student did it. He'll be angry at first, but I'll deal with it. What matters is that I finally got what I wanted. Vikram couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Confusion, relief, and perhaps even a bit of pride for helping his teacher. But as he gathered his things and prepared to leave, he knew one thing for certain. This was a day neither of them would ever forget. Vikram left Sema's house, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. He had never imagined himself in such a strange and intimate situation. And now that it was over, a wave of confusion and uncertainty washed over him. As he walked down the quiet street toward his home, he couldn't stop thinking about Sema's intense request and the weight of what he'd done. Despite his unease, there was a part of him that felt proud for helping her. He respected Sema deeply and hoped she would find peace with her decision. Inside the house, Sema remained seated in front of the mirror, gently running her hand over her smooth scalp. A wide smile crept across her face as she admired her reflection. The sensation of her bare scalp beneath her fingers was everything she had imagined and more. After so many years of suppressing this desire, she finally felt free. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief that Vikram had gone along with her plan. But there was still a lingering fear in the back of her mind. What would her husband say? Her happiness was short-lived. That evening, her husband returned home from work. As soon as he stepped through the door and saw her bald head, his expression shifted from confusion to anger, his eyes narrowed, and he stormed toward her, his voice rising with fury. What have you done? He shouted, his face contorted with rage. Why would you do this to yourself? You know how I feel about this. Sema's heart raced. She had anticipated his reaction, but the intensity of his anger was more than she had expected. Her hands trembled as she stood up, trying to calm him down. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice shaky. It wasn't my choice. Her husband's face twisted in confusion. What do you mean it wasn't your choice? You're the one who did it. Sema's mind raced for an explanation. She couldn't tell him the truth, that she had been the one to plan the whole thing. Desperately, she blurted out the first thing that came to mind. It wasn't me, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. It was a student. He's the one who shaved my head. Her husband stared at her in disbelief. A student? You let one of your students shave your head? Sema nodded, her tears now flowing freely down her face. He came over for homework and I didn't want it. But he insisted. I couldn't stop him. I didn't know what to do. Her husband's anger only grew at her words. You let a boy from your class do this to you? This is unacceptable. He paced the room, his fists clenched. Sema, sobbing now, tried to plead with him. Please don't be angry. It was a mistake. I didn't know how to handle the situation. But her husband was beyond reason. His anger had reached a boiling point. And now all he could think about was revenge. He glared at Sema, his voice cold and menacing. Tomorrow, he said through gritted teeth, I'm going to that boy's house. I'm going to shave his head. And not just his head. I'll shave his mother's head too. She clearly didn't raise him right. Sema's eyes widened in horror. No, you can't do that. Please don't involve them. This was my fault. I should have stopped him. But her husband wasn't listening. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Sema collapsed onto the bed, her heart pounding with fear. She had never seen him this angry before, and now she was terrified of what he might do. The rest of the night was a blur. Sema lay awake in bed, her mind racing with guilt and regret. She Vikram, but it was too late. Her husband was determined to punish the boy, and she had no idea how to stop him.